Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever looked at your own reflection and thought, that's not me? I never had until tonight. It was just another evening, or at least that's what I thought. The city outside my apartment was alive with the usual hum of traffic and distant conversations. The wind outside pressed against the window, sending the curtains swaying gently. I was standing by the window, absent-mindedly staring out at the night, when it happened. The reflection caught my eye. At first, I thought it was nothing. Just a fleeting glimpse. A trick of the light, perhaps. But when I turned my head, there it was again. A figure. A person. Standing just behind me in the reflection, staring back at me. I froze. The thing was, it wasn't me. It looked like me, same build, same hair, but it wasn't. The eyes were wrong. There was something off about them. They were wide, too wide, and there was a glimmer of something in them, something cold, something I couldn't place. I blinked and turned quickly, expecting to see the person standing behind me. But the room was empty. The only sound was the faint rustle of the curtains. The reflection was gone. My heart hammered in my chest. It's just the light, I told myself. It's nothing. But the unease wouldn't leave. I approached the window, my hands trembling as I pulled the curtains aside. The street below was quiet. No one stood there. Just the usual late-night crowd walking by. I let out a shaky breath and looked back at the reflection in the glass. It's fine. I tried to convince myself. But when I looked again, I saw something even worse. The figure had moved closer. In the reflection, its face was just over my shoulder. It was smiling now. That wide, twisted grin that didn't belong to me. My stomach turned, and I stumbled backward. I turned again, my pulse quickening, but the room remained silent. Empty. My mind raced. What's happening? There was no way I could explain it. I tried to focus on the reflection, staring hard into the glass. My own face stared back at me, my features tired and drawn from the long day. But in the reflection, there was something else, someone else. It was standing behind me again. Its face, so close, I could almost feel the chill of its breath on my neck. I whirled around, but once again, there was nothing. Just the quiet emptiness of my apartment. This isn't real, I thought, but my voice trembled as I whispered the words to myself. This isn't real. But the fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. The reflection was changing, moving on its own, like it wasn't bound by the same rules as the world around me. It was only a second, just a fleeting second, but I saw it. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye. Something tall and shadowy, out of place in the room. I turned my head so fast I almost lost my balance, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty space. It's just my imagination, I told myself again, forcing the thought into my mind. But even as I said it, I felt a growing dread quill around my chest, suffocating me. There was no way to ignore it. The reflection wasn't just wrong, it was alive. And it was watching me. I couldn't tear myself away from the window, my gaze locked on the glass as if I were trying to outlast the thing in the reflection. The night outside seemed to stretch longer, the darkness pressing in against the walls of my apartment. Then, suddenly, there was a noise. A faint sound from behind me. A soft shuffle. I turned around, my heart racing, but no one was there. The air in the room had changed, become thick, heavy. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look back at the window. The reflection was different now. The figure was no longer behind me. Instead, it was staring directly at me. Its face, no longer distorted, was clear as day. But it wasn't my face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that bore into me. The mouth twisted into a grin so wide it stretched beyond human limits. I could feel it now, the cold presence pressing in around me. I reached out toward the glass, my hand shaking as it hovered near the surface. And then it smiled. A deep, unnerving smile that made my blood run cold. I felt something shift in the air, something pulling at my mind. I pulled my hand back quickly, my breath shallow. What was this? What was happening to me? Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind, perhaps? Or was this something else? The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It had crossed a boundary, and in doing so, it had become something that shouldn't exist. The longer I stood there, staring at that impossible figure, the more I felt the line between reality and nightmare begin to blur. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. I couldn't look away. I couldn't escape it. It felt like it was pulling me in. And then, the figure in the reflection moved again. This time, it didn't just smile. It raised a hand. Its fingers, long and thin, reached toward me, tapping the glass. 1, 2, 3 times. Each tap echoed in the silence of my apartment, louder than the last. I stumbled back. The reflection's hand was still there, tapping, its fingers pressing against the glass from the other side. The cold dread that had settled deep in my chest now twisted into something else entirely, paranoia. I wasn't alone in this apartment anymore. Someone else was here with me, and I had no idea what it wanted. I should have left. I should have run. But in the back of my mind, I wondered, had I ever really been alone? As the tapping continued, I realized something even more terrifying. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was waiting for me. I couldn't stop shaking. The tapping from the reflection didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, each tap like a countdown, 1, 2, 3. Over and over. And each time, the chill in the room seemed to grow. The air felt thicker now, pressing against my skin, like the weight of the world was closing in on me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to that figure, to the hand pressed against the glass, the cold, lifeless fingers moving with unnatural precision. It was as if the thing in the window was waiting, watching. Its gaze never wavered from me, its grin widening ever so slightly. "What do you want?" I whispered to myself, but the words barely left my lips, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had taken over the room. I was paralyzed, my breath shallow, heart racing. I could feel the sweat pooling at the back of my neck, my mind reeling with questions. Was this some sort of trick? A hallucination? But the more I tried to rationalize, the more the fear took hold. It was real. It had to be. The reflection wasn't just an image. It was something else, something malevolent. I reached for the nearest object, a lamp, anything to ground myself, anything to break the hold the reflection had over me. But as I moved my arm, I felt something shift in the air. A gust of cold wind swept through the room, sending the curtains fluttering violently. I jerked back, eyes wide, looking around the room. There was no open window. The gust wasn't from outside. The air felt wrong. The walls themselves seemed to close in on me. It's in here. It's in here with me. I turned back to the window, but the figure was no longer just standing there. It had moved. It was now crouched, its body folded unnaturally at the edge of the reflection, its face obscured by the dim lighting of the room. Its hands, those long, sickly fingers, pressed against the glass now, leaving behind smears as if it were trying to push through. My own reflection seemed to bend in the glass, its features distorted and twisted as though something inside me was warping reality. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The only thing I could hear was the thudding of my own pulse in my ears. Then, a voice. Soft at first, barely a whisper, like a breath behind me. You're not alone. I whipped around, but again, there was no one there. The room was empty. I was alone. But the voice, it felt too real. Too close. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts scrambled as I tried to make sense of it. The reflection, the voice, the whispers, they couldn't be real. Could they? Was my mind finally breaking? Or was something far darker taking shape right before my eyes? The shadow in the reflection shifted again. This time, it didn't move like a person. It moved like something inhuman. The limbs twisted at angles, jerking into unnatural positions. And those eyes, finally locked with mine. The hollow, black sockets seemed to pull at my very soul. It was like looking into an abyss. No, this can't be happening. The thought was a mantra in my head, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic. I needed to get out. I had to get away from this. But the fear kept me rooted to the spot. My legs refused to move. It was as if the reflection was feeding off my terror, growing stronger with every passing second. I glanced around the room, looking for any escape. But the more I looked, the more I realized everything had changed. The familiar walls were now looming alien. The shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting like sentient things. The very room itself had become a trap. Was I losing my mind? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. But it was getting harder to focus. The reflection, it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a presence, something that was there with me, in the same space. A shadow that shouldn't exist. A thing that lived and breathed and watched. The tapping on the glass stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only the silence. But that silence was worse than the sound. It was suffocating. Then came the voice again, this time louder, clearer. You can't hide. My breath hitched in my throat. I had to do something. I couldn't let it control me. I took a step toward the door. Then another. But each step felt like wading through thick water, the air heavy, thick with dread. The reflection in the window, still smiling, still watching, followed my every move. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. But the second I touched it, the room seemed to lurch. The walls seemed to press in on me, pushing me back. My pulse hammered in my chest as the fear gripped me tighter, locking my body in place. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was trapping me inside. No. No, no, no. I pulled harder, but the door stayed shut. And then I heard it, the sound I feared the most. The reflection in the window was moving. The figure was getting closer. The tapping began again, but this time it was more frantic, louder, more insistent. The thing in the window wasn't trying to stay behind the glass anymore. It was trying to break through. I have to get out. I backed away from the door, panic rising. There was nowhere to go. No escape. The room had become a cage. And that's when I saw it. The reflection. It wasn't just a figure in the window anymore. It had stepped out. Its long, twisted form now loomed behind me, its dark eyes fixed on me, its grin wider than before, stretching beyond what was humanly possible. It was here. I could feel it. It was there, just behind me. The air in the room thickened, becoming almost suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling sharp glass, and I couldn't breathe deeply enough to escape the growing panic clawing at my chest. My heart raced, thundering so loud in my ears that it drowned out the other sounds, the tapping, the whispers, the horrible shuffling of that thing's movements. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs, like before, refused to obey. They were heavy, like lead, glued to the floor by the terror that poured from every corner of the room. I could sense it now. Its presence was all-consuming, pressing on my skin, making every hair on my body stand up. The reflection in the glass, the thing that had been so distant, so intangible, was now real. It had stepped up from the confines of the window, twisting and turning as it stretched its limbs unnaturally. Its head, its face, tilted at an impossible angle, and that smile. It wasn't a smile anymore. It was a grotesque grin, stretched too wide, with teeth too sharp, like something designed to eat, to tear apart. I couldn't stop staring at it. My mind screamed at me to look away, to run, but my eyes were locked on that grin, and I couldn't break free. It was as if it was drawing me in, pulling me toward it with invisible strings. How is this real? I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, constricted. Nothing came out. The reflection wasn't just mimicking my movements anymore. It was mirroring me, but it wasn't me. Its movements were slow, jerking in a sickening imitation of my own. The thing in the window, no, the thing in the room, was now stepping toward me. Its long fingers, pale, almost translucent, with skin stretched thin over bone, crawled across the floor like spider legs. It moved with an eerie, deliberate slowness, dragging its body along the floor as if it didn't need to walk like a human. It was something else entirely. The floorboards creaked under its weight, but it didn't care. It just kept coming. I finally found my voice, barely, and whispered to the thing, though I didn't even know what I expected. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, everything went silent. No more tapping. No more shuffling. The air around me felt thick with expectation. Then, the voice, the same voice from the window, whispered again, but this time it was closer, so close that I could feel the coldness of its words brush against my ear. "You cannot escape." I jerked away, my body trembling uncontrollably, but I couldn't look away. It had me in its grip now. The thing in the room was too close. I could see every horrifying detail, the pallor of its skin, the sickly sheen of sweat on its forehead, the way its face seemed to stretch unnaturally as it smiled. And the eyes. Those empty, hollow eyes. They weren't human. Nothing about it was human. I need to escape. I need to get out. The thought was sharp, urgent, and yet it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. My hands were shaking violently now as I reached for the door again. But when I touched the handle, the room seemed to distort around me, the air pushing against me as if trying to force me back into the reflection. The door wouldn't open. It was stuck. The thing behind me was getting closer. I could hear its breath now, ragged, deep, too heavy for something that should be dead. Each inhalation was like the air itself was being sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping, fighting for every breath. Suddenly, the room seemed to warp. The walls moved in closer, the ceiling lowered, and the space grew smaller, tighter. The windows, those damned windows, were no longer clear, but clouded, like the world outside had been replaced by a black void. There was no escape. Am I losing my mind? The thing was now right behind me. Its breath on my neck felt cold and suffocating, like ice against my skin. I wanted to turn around, to face it, but I couldn't. I couldn't look. Not yet. I needed to keep my distance, but there was nowhere to go. And then it spoke again. Its voice was like 1,000 whispers all coming together, a chorus of voices that felt ancient, predatory. This is your world now. My mind shattered. It felt like everything inside me, my thoughts, my sanity, my sense of reality, began to crumble. The reflection was no longer just a trick of the light. It wasn't some illusion or a figment of my imagination. It had crossed over. It had entered my reality, and now it was here, with me, a part of this space. The smile widened, impossibly so, and then the thing's face contorted into something grotesque. The skin on its face stretched, bulging out, as if it were trying to break free from the bones underneath. It was becoming something else, something worse, something other. It was now standing directly in front of me. Its hands, pale and skeletal, reached out toward me, the long fingers twitching with hunger. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The terror in my chest was choking me. I had no control anymore. I could feel its breath against my ear, cold and foul. And then, in a voice that was no longer soft, but sharp, it whispered, "You will join me. You are mine." In that moment, my vision blurred. I felt the world around me start to melt away. The room no longer existed. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they dissolved, leaving nothing but that grinning thing and the sound of my own terrified breath. And then, everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, my body soaked in cold sweat. The world around me felt wrong, distorted, as though the air itself was thick with some invisible pressure, squeezing my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I was still in my apartment. I could tell by the familiar smell of dust and old furniture, but something was off. The walls seemed too close. The shadows in the corners were deeper, darker, more alive. I blinked, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare, or was it a nightmare? Wasn't it real? The reflection. The thing. The voice. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the thoughts out of my head, but they clung to me like cold fingers, pulling me back into that moment, into the suffocating darkness where I couldn't escape. It wasn't real, I told myself. But something deep inside me refused to believe it. The light in the room flickered, once, twice, and then went out. I froze, heart pounding. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its dull glow flickering weakly like it was struggling to stay on. And yet, despite the dim light, the shadows stretched longer, darker. They seemed to twist, to move of their own accord, like they were shifting toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively backed away. I reached for my phone, desperate for some kind of connection to reality, to the outside world. My fingers trembled as I unlocked it, my hands slick with sweat. The screen was blank. No signal. No connection. My heart sank. No, no, no. Not again. The silence in the room was deafening. The kind of silence that presses in on you, heavy and suffocating. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, inch by inch, but the more I tried to breathe, the less I could. The air felt stale, almost suffocating. And then I heard it. A whisper. At first, it was soft, like the faintest rustle of leaves, so subtle I could have convinced myself it was my imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, clearer. The words were indistinct, as if they were being spoken from the other side of the room, but they were there. I could hear them. Come closer. The voice was low, a rasping whisper that made my skin crawl. I turned, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just shadows, just emptiness. It's just your mind playing tricks, I thought. It's just a fear. It's nothing. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was there. Watching me. Waiting. I stumbled to my feet, feeling unsteady, dizzy. The room seemed to sway around me, as though the very air was distorted, stretching and bending in ways it shouldn't. The floor beneath me felt soft, spongy, like it wasn't solid. I had to grab the nearest piece of furniture to steady myself, my hand gripping the edge of the coffee table. And that's when I saw it again, the reflection. This time, it wasn't in the window. It wasn't in the mirror. It was in the glass of the picture frame on the shelf across the room. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks. The reflection of the room distorted by the glass, but then I saw it. The figure. It was there. It wasn't in my mind. The thing stood behind me, just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't see it fully, not yet, but I knew it was there. It was waiting. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was something else. It had the same outline, the same shape, but the face was wrong. The eyes were too wide, too empty, and the smile, oh God, that smile, it was stretched and unnatural, like it was trying to break free from the reflection. I turned around, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, silent room. I stumbled backward, panic setting in. It's not real. It can't be real. But even as I thought it, the reflection in the glass shifted. I saw it more clearly now. The thing in the window wasn't standing anymore. It was crouched, huddled like an animal, its eyes burning with hunger, a darkness pooling in its pupils. It's not me, I realized. It's something else. Something that had found its way into my life, into my world. The whisper came again, louder now, almost urgent, come closer. It felt like it was in my head, in my very bones. The voice was cold, venomous, like it was pulling me toward the thing in the reflection. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me, and I was paralyzed, frozen in place. It felt like I was slipping into something deeper, darker. Like I was being pulled. But I couldn't give in. I couldn't let it take me. I had to get out. With every ounce of strength left in me, I forced my legs to move. My feet were heavy, clumsy as I stumbled toward the door, my mind screaming, "Get out! Get out!" But before I could reach the door, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, just behind me. They were so close now, so real, that I could feel the breath of whatever it was behind me. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards beneath its weight. And then I felt it, a cold touch, ice cold, on the back of my neck. I screamed. I whipped around, heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was nothing there. No one. Just the stillness of the room, the oppressive silence pressing on me from all sides. But I could feel it, feel the coldness on my neck, feel the presence lingering just beyond my sight, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. It's not real. I repeated the words in my head like a mantra, trying to push the fear out, trying to force some rationality back into my brain. But it wasn't working. I couldn't escape it. The feeling that something was there. That I wasn't alone. The temperature in the room had dropped, and I could see my breath fogging the air. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the light whole, turning everything into a suffocating black void. I turned toward the window, desperately trying to find something normal, something familiar, but the glass seemed to warp under my gaze, bending and twisting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. I needed to get out of here. But as I moved toward the door, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was clearer, sharper, like it was right in my ear. You can't escape. I froze, my hand halfway to the doorknob, my pulse pounding in my ears. The voice, it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was here. In the room. In the very space I was standing. I spun around, trying to find the source, but all I saw was the same empty room, the same distorted reflections in the glass, the same stretching shadows. And then I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, like something moving toward me from the other side of the room. I took a step back, my body screaming to run, to escape, but I was frozen. Paralyzed by the fear, by the certainty that whatever was behind me was going to get me if I moved. Don't look. Don't look. But I couldn't stop myself. My eyes were drawn to the reflection in the window again. At first, there was nothing. Just the dark shape of my own reflection, distorted by the glass. But then it appeared. The figure. The one that wasn't me. I couldn't make out its features fully, but I saw enough. The eyes, empty and hollow, staring back at me with a cold, knowing gaze. The mouth, stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't belong on any human face. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I took a step forward, my legs shaking, my breath shallow. The figure in the reflection shifted, moved, as though it could hear me. It tilted its head to the side, the same grin never leaving its face, and then it moved toward me. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the air around me seemed to thicken, the shadows closing in. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. I wasn't safe here anymore. Not from this thing. Not from the reflection that was slowly consuming me, twisting everything I knew into something unrecognizable. I reached for the door again, this time managing to twist the knob, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. No, no, no. The footsteps were closer now, louder, more insistent. I could hear them right behind me. My pulse quickened, the sound of my own breathing filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I turned to face the door again, slamming my shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. And then, there it was. A hand, cold and clammy, on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one. No one in the room with me. But the hand, it was still there. I could feel it, pressing down on me, holding me in place, as though it was part of the reflection, part of the thing that was stalking me. I tried to jerk away, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught between reality and whatever nightmare had taken hold of me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body trembling with the effort to break free, but it was no use. I couldn't escape. The reflection moved again. This time, it didn't just move, it stepped forward into the room with me. I watched, horrified, as the figure slowly emerged from the glass, its features becoming clearer, sharper. The empty eyes, the twisted smile. It was like looking into a mirror, except this wasn't me. This wasn't any version of me. It was something else. Something I could never have imagined. And then it spoke. It's too late. The words were so cold, so final, they made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The room was closing in around me, the walls pressing together, the shadows swallowing everything whole. And the reflection, it was coming closer. 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 Until there was no more room left to breathe. You belong to me now. The voice was closer than ever, right beside my ear, like the thing was whispering directly into my soul. And then everything went black. Have you ever felt that sinking sensation, not in your stomach, but deep within your soul? Like something is wrong, but you can't place it? It's the kind of feeling that starts small, just a flicker in your mind, but it grows, slowly, until it becomes a weight that presses against your chest. I was on the lift, heading down to the ground floor. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another day in the city. But as the lift doors slid closed, a cold chill swept over me, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the control panel, no lights, no numbers. Only the dim, flickering light above. My fingers twitched, but I held myself still. It had to be nothing. Just a glitch. I pressed the button for the ground floor again. The lift jerked, a violent shake that rattled my bones. I felt the air grow thicker, as though the space inside was shrinking, the walls closing in. A low hum filled the space. I couldn't place it. A sound I hadn't noticed before. But it was there, in the background, crawling under my skin. I tried to ignore it. The first stop came without warning. The doors slid open, but there was nothing outside, only darkness. Not the kind of darkness that you expect in an empty building. No, this was deeper, more suffocating, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. I hesitated. The lift didn't seem right, but it was just a lift, right? A simple thing. I glanced at the panel again. It showed a floor number, but I didn't recognize it. A floor that shouldn't be there. My heart began to beat faster, and my hand instinctively hovered over the button to close the doors, but before I could press it, the lift jolted again. It felt as though the very foundation of the building shifted beneath me. The doors slid shut on their own. I couldn't breathe. Something was wrong, and I was already too deep to turn back. The next stop. The lift made its way down, but the air felt thicker, as though something had shifted, something that had never been there before. And that sound, that low hum, it hadn't stopped. It was louder now, as if it was coming from within the walls of the lift. The walls felt too close, suffocating. My pulse quickened as I began to feel the sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. But I couldn't see anything. Nothing was there, yet everything felt wrong. My mind raced. When the doors opened again, I expected to see the same empty darkness, but instead, there was a hallway. A long corridor that stretched far beyond the lift, its far end lost in shadows. The walls looked familiar. I had seen this hallway before, but where? The space seemed to stretch in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I stepped forward, but the doors slammed shut before I could fully step out. My heart pounded as I pressed the button for the ground floor, but the lift didn't move. Not at first. And then, it started to rise. Slowly. I wasn't going down anymore. I was going up. Higher. Higher. The numbers on the control panel flickered and changed, and I could feel my breathing growing more erratic. I stared at the walls, my reflection dimly visible in the metal surface. The reflection wasn't quite right. My stomach dropped, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a malfunction. This wasn't just a broken lift. This was something else entirely. Something waiting for me. I was no longer sure if I was still in the lift or if the lift was still a part of the building at all. And that, in itself, terrified me more than anything I had ever felt before. The lift continued its ascent, but it felt wrong. There was no jolt, no sudden movement. It wasn't the steady, mechanical hum I knew. Instead, it moved like it was pulling something inside, something dark that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I pressed the button again. And again. My finger trembling as it hovered over the buttons, but nothing changed. I watched the panel flicker, floor 9 it read, then flickered to floor 10, then to floor 14. The numbers were impossibilities. The higher it climbed, the more surreal the experience became. This wasn't my building. This wasn't even reality. I tried to rationalize it. I wanted to believe this was a malfunction, some glitch in the system, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the knot tightening in my stomach told me it wasn't just that. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I could hear it now, the faintest whisper. So soft it seemed like it was in my head. My eyes darted to the corners of the lift. The air was still and thick with a strange smell. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't quite normal either. Like something wet and decayed was seeping into the air. I couldn't pinpoint it, but it made my skin crawl. My throat tightened as I tried to breathe in the stale, heavy air. The elevator slowed. The hum grew louder, rising into something more like a growl now. And then, the doors opened again. I wasn't on a familiar floor. No, I was in a completely different place. The hallway outside the lift was long and narrow, stretching into an abyss of shadows. The walls were cracked and worn, as if the building was decaying from within. The faint light from the lift barely illuminated the space beyond the doors, casting eerie reflections on the floor. I took a cautious step forward, but the air felt colder, unnaturally so, like stepping into the dead of winter, despite the heat outside. I turned to glance behind me, hoping to find the familiar safety of the lift. But the doors were already closing. The metallic clang echoed in the hallway, as though I was being shut out. The hallway stretched further than it should have. The walls were uneven, with strange, unnatural patterns that didn't match the rest of the building. Faded murals that looked like something out of a nightmare, disjointed faces, contorted shapes, and twisting forms. They weren't paintings. No. These were carvings, etched into the walls with deep grooves, as if something had been scratching at them for years, digging into the very flesh of the building. A cold breeze brushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. The hair on my arm stood up as the whispering sound grew louder. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a voice. A low, distorted voice that was speaking in a language I didn't understand. Panic bubbled up inside me. I turned back toward the lift, but the doors were gone. The lift was nowhere to be seen. The hallway had consumed it, and all that was left was the vast emptiness ahead. The voice was still there. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I backed away, my heart racing as I looked around. The walls seemed to pulse, alive, as though they were breathing with me. I had to get out. I had to find a way back. But with every step I took, the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, and the air thicker. A low creak echoed behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the long, empty corridor stretching endlessly. My breath came out in quick, shallow bursts. Sweat dripped down my face, and my legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unresponsive. I could hear the voice again. This time, it was clearer. It was speaking directly to me. Turn around. The words, though distorted, sounded almost familiar. I stood frozen, my body locked in place. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Slowly, very slowly, I turned around, the voice urging me on. And there, at the end of the hallway, something moved. It was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, silhouetted against the dim light. It seemed to stretch unnaturally, like it was too big to fit in this space. Its shape was indistinct, like a smear of dark smoke, but I could feel its presence. It was wrong. It was beyond wrong. I couldn't move. The thing shifted. The floor beneath me groaned as if reacting to its presence. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the silence. And then it spoke. You shouldn't be here. The words were clear now. The voice wasn't just from the walls or the air, it was coming from it. From that figure. It seemed to consume the space, reverberating through the very core of my being. And then it stepped forward. The world tilted. The walls warped around me. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor, the cold, rough surface pressing against my skin. I had to get out. But there was nowhere to go. The thing was moving closer now. Closer. Closer. And I couldn't escape. I could barely breathe. The air felt heavier than it had moments ago, suffocating me with each breath. My body shook as I tried to push myself off the cold floor, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Every muscle seemed to have turned to jelly, my mind racing with the images of that figure looming ahead, its dark, shadowy form stretching toward me. The whispering voice continued, but it wasn't speaking directly to me anymore. It was calling to something. Not to me, but to something behind me. The air was thick with its presence, pressing against me like invisible hands. My chest tightened as I gasped for breath, but the air was too thick, too dense to allow even the smallest amount of relief. I tried to turn my head, but every movement felt sluggish, as though time itself had slowed down in this place. I could see the figure clearer now, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't human, but its shape reminded me of one, tall, too tall, its shoulders hunched and its arms reaching out, fingers like elongated claws. A pulse of cold air swept over me, and I felt something shift. Something was in the air now, something I couldn't see, but it was there, surrounding me, creeping under my skin. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. The figure moved again, gliding smoothly, its shape warping and distorting in the dim light. It seemed to be floating, its feet not touching the ground, but hovering just inches above the floor. The voice grew louder, more urgent, but still distorted, a mix of guttural growls and incomprehensible words. I could feel it, like something was calling me. My stomach twisted, and my thoughts scrambled. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I forced my body to move. My hands gripped the floor, scraping the rough surface beneath me as I pushed myself up. Each breath was a struggle, my chest burning, but my survival instincts kicked in. I had to escape. I had to get out of there. My legs finally obeyed, albeit weakly, and I stumbled to my feet. The figure, however, didn't move. It just watched. That unnerving, endless gaze seemed to pierce through the shadows, locking onto me. Its presence was suffocating, and yet I couldn't stop looking at it. Something about it held me there, frozen in place. I took a step back, and that was when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the lift doors opening. For a moment, I hesitated. Could I trust it? Could I trust the lift to take me somewhere safe? But the moment I thought about it, the figure in front of me seemed to grow. The shadows around it darkened, twisting and turning like a vortex, threatening to pull me into them. It took another step forward. The door to the lift remained open, the soft hum inviting me in. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet pounded against the floor, the sound reverberating in the narrow hallway. I didn't dare look back. The figure was too close now. I could hear its breath, or was it mine, coming in ragged gasps, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening growl that came from behind me. It was gaining on me. I reached the lift and dug inside just as the doors began to close. The instant they shut, a deep, guttural hiss filled the space, and I heard the sound of something heavy slamming against the walls. The lift lurched forward, a harsh pull that nearly knocked me to the ground. The panels flickered again, and I saw a new set of numbers appear, unfamiliar, strange, and out of place. I pressed the button for the ground floor, but the lift didn't stop. Instead, it sped up, the numbers climbing faster than before. Floor 30. Floor 50. Floor 72. My heart was in my throat as I watched the numbers rise. I turned around, but the figure wasn't there. The lift was empty, just me. Still, the sensation of being watched didn't go away. That pressure, that suffocating weight, was still there. The air felt cold, unnatural. The lights above flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then the sound began. A faint tapping at first, like something small moving across the floor. It grew louder, rhythmic, like footsteps. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly looked down at my feet. There was nothing there. But the tapping continued. It was coming from below me, from beneath the lift, from the depths of whatever nightmare this was. It was so close, I could almost feel the vibrations in my bones. The tapping grew louder, faster, and suddenly it stopped. I was paralyzed, my heart racing, as the lift came to a halt. The doors opened, and there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The void outside was infinite. There was no sound, no light, no escape. But something stepped forward. Something from the darkness. I heard a whisper. Clearer this time. You shouldn't have come. And that voice, it wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. And it was closer than ever. The darkness that spread beyond the lift was thick, impenetrable. I stared into it, waiting for something, anything, to emerge. The air inside the lift felt charged, as though the very atmosphere had become heavy with expectation. I could hear the faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing now, slow, shallow, like something was just outside the lift doors, waiting for me to make a move. I took a cautious step forward, my feet hesitant, my legs weak beneath me. The tapping sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than anything else. The darkness beyond the doors was suffocating. I couldn't see beyond a few feet, but I could feel it. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I had to get out. I had to. My fingers gripped the edge of the lift door, the cold metal biting into my skin as I pulled at it. But no matter how hard I pushed, the doors wouldn't close. They remained open, a gaping mouth, waiting to swallow me whole. A voice came again. This time, it was clear, unmistakable. Step outside. I froze. The voice wasn't distorted anymore. It was calm, patient, as though it had been waiting for me to understand. It was neither malevolent nor kind, but something in it felt like it was toying with me, drawing me closer, pushing me into the depths of whatever nightmare I had stepped into. I stepped back, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The lift's interior was bathed in a flickering light, and the walls seemed to pulse, as though they were breathing along with me. The humming sound from before returned, but this time it wasn't just an annoying buzz. It was the sound of something deeper, something more ancient, like the very building itself was alive, watching me. Then, just as quickly as it began, the humming stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. The sensation of being watched, the pressure in the air, grew unbearable. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get out of the lift, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, unable to move. The darkness beyond the doors called to me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, its invitation more terrifying than anything I had felt before. I glanced down at the control panel. The numbers had stopped moving, frozen at floor 999. My chest tightened as I realized the lift had ascended far beyond any building's limits. This wasn't a regular lift anymore. It wasn't even a lift. It was a passage. A gateway. I turned back to the open doors. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the darkness. It wasn't like the shadowy form from before. This one was real. Solid. A silhouette of a man, but distorted, wrong. His body stretched unnaturally, his limbs too long, too thin. His face was obscured by a shadow that seemed to consume him, but I could feel his eyes that stared at me from the depths of that blackness, seeing through me, pulling at me, as though he knew every secret I had ever kept. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The figure didn't move, but his presence was overwhelming. It was like he was reaching out to me without moving, his essence sinking into me, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, to run, but my mouth was dry. My voice had left me. It was as if the very air had stolen it, leaving me mute in the face of whatever horror this was. The figure spoke, his voice a rasping whisper, barely audible but heavy with meaning. You came here because you were searching for answers. But answers don't exist in this place. Only darkness. A wave of panic washed over me. I knew I had to escape, but I didn't know how. The lift didn't belong to this world anymore. It had taken me far beyond the boundaries of anything I could comprehend. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. This wasn't the city, wasn't the building I had started in. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the edge of the lift's floor. But before I could react, the door slammed shut. The sound of the metal clanging against itself rang in my ears, echoing throughout the empty space. I was alone again. The light inside the lift flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, reaching for me, just out of my reach. The air felt even colder now, and the silence was deafening. But there was no more sound from outside. No more whispering voices. The stillness was suffocating. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the lift's wall, my fingertips tingling as I touched it. The wall felt wrong. Like it was alive, where something was moving just beneath the surface. I jumped back as I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. But it wasn't from outside the lift. It was coming from within, from deep within the walls. I wasn't alone. The walls of the lift seemed to close in around me, the space shrinking with each passing second. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, faster and faster, as the oppressive weight of whatever had taken hold of the space around me crushed my lungs. I reached for the control panel again, but the buttons were no longer there. The lift was empty, a hollow shell, and I was trapped inside it. The floor beneath me began to tremble. And then the voice came again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds of voices, all speaking at once, an overwhelming cacophony of whispers, screams, and laughter. The sound clawed at my ears, making my mind spin until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. You should have never come. The walls of the lift began to distort. The metal twisted and bent as though the entire lift was being pulled apart from the inside. The space was warping. My body felt pulled in different directions, as if the very gravity inside was being altered. I could feel myself being torn away from reality. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The lift was still, silent, unmoving. But the terror never stopped. I could feel the ground beneath me, if it was still the ground at all, shifting, as though reality itself was unraveling. The air, thick with dread and the remnants of those voices, hung in the lift, pressing against me from all sides. Each breath felt like it was the last, and every time I blinked, the world around me seemed to warp, shift, and stretch. I wanted to scream, but the weight in my chest silenced me, suffocating any sound I tried to make. The walls, once cold and unyielding, now pulsed like a living thing. The metal was bending, twisting, groaning under some unseen force, and the once bright lights overhead flickered erratically. The ceiling seemed to sag, the lights flickering and dimming further, casting grotesque shadows across the lift. I tried to focus, tried to steady myself, but the distortion of space was too much. I could feel myself losing my grip on reality. There were no windows. No way out. Just four walls, a floor, a ceiling, and me, trapped within them. The whispering voices returned, louder this time, like a chorus of tortured souls filling every inch of the lift. They were no longer just whispers, they were distinct, clear, and filled with anguish. I could hear cries of desperation, begging, pleading, and some voices, so familiar now, sounded almost like my own thoughts. You shouldn't have come here. It's too late for you. There is no escape. My hands were shaking as I pressed them against the cold walls, hoping to ground myself. The lift was still moving, rising, or was it descending? The motion felt wrong, like it was neither going up nor down, but sideways, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I glanced at the numbers on the control panel, but they had stopped entirely. They were no longer just flickering, the screen was cracked, spider-webbed across its surface, unable to show any sort of progress. It was frozen. Trapped. What do you want from me? The thought echoed in my head, louder than the voices around me. It was the one question I couldn't answer. Whatever this place was, whatever had taken me here, I couldn't begin to understand it. I could feel the pressure mounting, pushing in from all sides, like I was being crushed in a vice. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone, brushing against my shoulder. I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see the figure from before, but it wasn't there. The lift was empty. There was nothing but the suffocating darkness creeping into the corners of the space. I glanced at the walls again. They were no longer solid metal. The surface had become porous, as though it were rotting, with dark, creeping tendrils growing from the cracks in the walls. I reached out, horrified, to touch one of them, but before my fingers made contact, the tendril jerked away as if it were alive. I stumbled back, breathless, but the sensation of being watched only intensified. The lift lurched again, and for a moment, I thought it would stop. But instead, the lights flickered again, and the doors opened. The sudden rush of cold air hit me like a wave, causing me to recoil. This wasn't the familiar building I'd come from. The air smelled different, stale, like damp earth and rust. It was like I had stepped into some forgotten space, somewhere beyond time, beyond reason. The darkness beyond the door stretched out, consuming everything in its path, pulling at me, threatening to swallow me whole. And there, at the edge of the blackness, was a figure. A tall, looming shadow, standing just beyond the threshold of the lift. It didn't move, not yet, but its presence was undeniable. A sharp, piercing cold radiated from it, chilling me to the core. I couldn't see its face, just that form, that outline, so tall, so impossibly tall. I could feel its eyes on me, even though they weren't visible. It wasn't just watching me, it was inside me. I could feel it, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The voice returned, louder this time, impossibly close. It wasn't the same distorted whisper anymore, it was clear, sharp, like a knife scraping against stone. You should never have come. Now, you are part of this place. The words cut through me, a visceral pain that burned in my veins. Part of this place. What did that mean? What did it want from me? My thoughts spun, a blur of confusion and terror. I tried to step back into the lift, to escape the thing that stood outside, but the doors wouldn't close. The lift had stopped responding entirely. I was trapped, not only within the lift, but within this place, whatever this was. I couldn't think. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I had to get away. I had to escape. I turned back to the figure. It still didn't move. But the air around me shifted, and I felt it, the same sensation I'd felt when I first entered the lift. It was as though the space around me was folding in on itself, warping and bending, becoming something else. The walls of the lift were no longer walls at all, but a part of the void. The figure, too, began to dissolve, its edges blurring and twisting like smoke in the wind. And then, the lift began to descend. The sound of the lift's cables creaking filled the air, the steady rhythm of it a haunting lullaby. The numbers on the control panel flickered again, slowly creeping down. Floor 88, floor 77, floor 66. And then the elevator stopped. The silence was deafening. The doors opened, and I saw nothing. Only the abyss. There was no escape. Have you ever found yourself walking somewhere you know so well, only to realize that nothing feels right? The streetlights flicker in a way that makes you question if they're even real. The pavement cracks and shifts beneath your feet, like the ground itself is trying to trick you. That's how it started. I had been walking home, as I always did, from the subway station. The usual route, the familiar landmarks, the old cafe on the corner, the row of apartment buildings with their cracked windows, the overgrown trees lining the sidewalk. Everything was supposed to feel the same. But it didn't. I could feel it in my bones, like the world around me was slightly tilted, off-center, as if it was slowly bending into something unfamiliar. I glanced at my phone. The time was normal. The weather was fine. But something wasn't right. My shoes hit the pavement in a rhythm I knew too well, yet the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the silence of the night. The city was always buzzing with noise, cars honking, people talking, distant sirens. But tonight, it was eerily quiet. As I walked, the streetlights seemed to stretch longer than usual. The shadows they cast didn't match the shapes they should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. My skin prickled with unease, a cold sweat forming at the back of my neck. I looked around, but there was no one. Only empty streets, abandoned storefronts, and darkened windows. I paused, trying to steady myself, taking in the familiar but disorienting surroundings. There was a strange smell in the air, something metallic, like rust, mixed with something faintly sweet, almost rotten. I couldn't place it, but it seemed to linger, clinging to the edges of my senses, making everything feel even more off. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the further I walked, the more the world around me seemed to twist. The street didn't look the same. It was still my street, but the way the buildings leaned and the sidewalks curved felt wrong. The corners of my vision seemed to darken, as though the space around me was folding in on itself. I stopped at the intersection where I would normally turn left to head down my block. But this time, I couldn't remember why I always turned there. It didn't feel right. The road ahead, the one I knew I'd taken 1,000 times before, now seemed unfamiliar. The buildings looked older here, their facades cracked and weathered. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My heart pounded in my chest, but I took a step forward, trying to force myself to move. Just keep walking. I had to get home. This was nothing. Just a trick of the mind. But then I heard it. A soft rustling sound, barely perceptible at first. A shuffle. A scrape against the concrete. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was no one behind me, but the sound persisted, growing louder, coming closer. Footsteps? But they weren't mine. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps followed, matching my stride. My breath quickened. I turned again, this time more frantic, searching for any sign of life, but all I saw were the empty streets and flickering lights. Was I imagining this? Was this some sort of sick joke my mind was playing on me? Then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. At first, I thought it was just another shadow cast by a streetlight, but as it grew closer, I realized it was a person. Or at least, it looked like a person. I couldn't make out any details. Just a dark shape moving in the periphery of my vision, always staying just out of reach, just outside the circle of light cast by the street lamp. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The air around me grew colder, a strange chill creeping up my spine. I should have turned back. I should have gone the other way, down a different street, anywhere but this path that had somehow become wrong. But my feet, they wouldn't stop. They kept moving forward, even though my mind screamed for me to stop, to turn, to run. And then I heard the voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but it carried a sense of urgency. It wasn't my own thoughts, not like before. This voice, it sounded familiar. It was a voice I had heard many times in my life. But where? Who? Turn around. I froze, the command echoing in my mind like a drumbeat. For a moment, I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, as if the air had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. I tried to respond, but my voice wouldn't come. Again, the whisper, turn around. And I did. Slowly. The figure was closer now, its outline sharper against the dim light. I still couldn't see its face, but I could feel the weight of its presence. It wasn't right. It wasn't real. I was sure of it. And yet, it stood there, watching me, waiting. I took a step backward, then another. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it pulling me in, like a magnet. My feet were frozen, stuck to the ground. I couldn't keep walking. I couldn't keep going forward, but I also couldn't go back. Was this really happening? Or was it just my mind, playing tricks on me? But as I stood there, staring at the figure, the air felt thicker, darker, like the entire street was closing in on me. The question echoed in my head, where am I? And in the distance, the footsteps continued to draw closer. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing against my lungs, squeezing the air out of me. My throat was dry, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was still there, standing motionless just a few feet away, yet its presence filled the space around me, like it had always been there, just waiting for me to notice. My body refused to move. It was as though the world had frozen, and I was trapped in a still, suffocating moment. The street was empty, but it felt full of something unseen, something I couldn't quite grasp. The pavement, the streetlights, the trees, they all felt like they were part of something larger, something darker. The figure remained silent, but the air around me seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't mine. It felt like it was pulling at me, tugging at my very soul, slowly wearing down whatever resolve I had left. It wasn't the way a person stood. There was no subtle shift of weight, no shift of the eyes. It was still, unnervingly still. I felt the cold creeping into my bones, the chill from the figure's presence seeping into my skin, and suddenly, I wanted to scream. But my throat wouldn't work. The terror that surged through me was so overwhelming that it paralyzed me. My feet were still rooted to the ground, and my mind screamed for me to move, to run, but every muscle in my body locked up. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The figure, it was a figment of my imagination. It was some trick my brain was playing on me. But the feeling in the air, the weight of its presence, it was too real. Too tangible. My thoughts scrambled, grasping at any explanation, anything to break the suffocating tension. The figure shifted. A small, almost imperceptible movement, and I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. The air seemed to pulse with an electric current now, crackling in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I still couldn't move. It was like the street had become a trap, and I was the prey, stuck in its snare. And then, the voice came again. Soft, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Turn around. This time, the voice wasn't just a whisper. It was clearer, more forceful. I felt it reverberating in my chest, deep in my bones. It felt like a command, like the voice was pushing me, compelling me to obey. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look away from the figure, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, its unseen eyes boring into me, and I couldn't stand it. Slowly, my body turned. My head moved as if controlled by something outside of myself, like my will wasn't my own anymore. The world around me seemed to blur as I rotated, and then I saw it. The street. The pavement. The same alley I'd walked down hundreds of times before. But it was wrong. It wasn't how I remembered it. The buildings were taller, their windows black and empty, like hollow eyes watching me. The trees that once lined the road now bent at unnatural angles, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, reaching toward me with bony fingers. I couldn't see clearly anymore. The world had been swallowed by a haze, a distortion of reality that made everything feel like a bad dream. Nothing was where it should be. The street that was once so familiar, the street I had always walked down to get home, it was gone. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled, my feet stumbling over uneven pavement. I was disoriented. Lost. But in the back of my mind, something was telling me that I had to keep moving. That if I stopped, if I didn't move forward, something far worse would happen. But every step I took only seemed to lead me deeper into this twisted version of reality. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, the buildings closing in around me like a maze with no exit. My breathing quickened, and I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of the air pressing against me. My mind screamed for me to wake up, to escape, but there was no way out. The streets kept shifting, turning into themselves, warping with every step I took. Behind me, the footsteps were still there. That same soft, rhythmic shuffle. It was closer now. Too close. My pulse was racing, each beat pounding in my ears, louder than the sound of my own breathing. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped inside me, like I couldn't reach it. My hands shook as I grabbed onto the nearest lamppost for support, trying to steady myself. But even as I clung to it, the street continued to warp around me, the buildings bending and twisting like paper, folding in on themselves. "Don't look back," the voice whispered again, its tone more insistent now. But I couldn't help it. I had to look. I had to know what was behind me. And when I did, my stomach dropped into my feet. The figure was there, standing at the end of the alley, its shape shifting and contorting like it was made of shadows, a dark mass that flickered in and out of existence. It didn't have a face, or at least, I couldn't make it out. There was only an impression, a feeling of something empty and vast staring at me from the depths of the darkness. It moved again. This time, it was not a small shift. It took a step forward, and with that movement, the entire alley seemed to pulse, like the ground beneath me was alive, breathing with a life of its own. I took a step back, my body shaking uncontrollably. But it didn't stop. It kept moving, slowly, inexorably, until it was just a few feet away from me. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was real. But I couldn't deny it was there. And I couldn't deny the terror it filled me with. I had to get away. I had to. But there was nowhere to go. My feet were moving before I even realized it, stumbling away from the creature that lingered in the darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air sharp in my lungs, but it didn't matter. I had to get away. I had to get out of this nightmare. I turned sharply, desperate to find a way out, but the alley seemed to stretch infinitely, each turn only leading to another dead end, another distorted street. The walls around me twisted, their once solid surfaces bending and warping in unnatural ways. The streetlights flickered and buzzed above, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced along the sidewalk like they were alive and watching me. Every time I thought I had found an escape, the world around me would shift again, distorting into something more unsettling. I turned a corner only to find the same alley repeating itself in front of me. I backed away from the wall, my hands trembling. Was I going in circles? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my panicked breaths, the thudding of my heart, and, just barely, those footsteps. They were still behind me, but they were different now. They weren't the soft, echoing shuffle of the figure from earlier. No, these steps were faster, heavier. They were closing in on me. I dared to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the darkness. But I felt it. I could feel the presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I would stop running, when I would succumb to the fear gnawing at my insides. I stumbled again, my foot catching on the uneven pavement, and I fell forward. My hands hit the ground, scraping against the rough texture of the asphalt. I winced in pain, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I pushed myself back to my feet and continued running, my legs burning with the strain. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I thought I'd gone, it was always there, just behind me. A few steps away. A breath away. The heavy, relentless footsteps that seemed to echo in my skull, drawing out everything else. I tried to focus on something, anything, to break the spiraling terror that was consuming me. I thought of home. I thought of the familiar sights that should have greeted me by now. I thought of the door, the warmth of my bed, the comfort of knowing I was safe. But the harder I tried to picture it, the more distant it became. The more unreachable. The streets weren't real anymore. The alley wasn't real. My home wasn't real. I didn't know what was real anymore. I kept running. I had no plan, no destination, just the need to escape. The city around me seemed to close in, the buildings narrowing, squeezing me in until I could barely breathe. It wasn't the claustrophobia of a crowd, though. It was something else. It was as if the city itself had become a living entity, and I was just a tiny, insignificant part of it, trapped inside its suffocating grasp. The footsteps were getting louder. I could hear them clearly now, each step like a drumbeat, reverberating in the air. Closer. Closer. I dared another look over my shoulder. This time, I saw it. The figure was standing at the end of the alley, its shadowy form flickering in and out of existence like a broken reflection. Its shape was harder to define now, like it was part of the darkness itself. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my skin, its presence pressing against my spine like a weight I couldn't shake. I turned away quickly, my head spinning, and pushed forward. I had to keep moving. I reached another corner, my breath ragged, my mind clouded with fear. I skidded around it, only to find nothing. The street was gone. The alley that had been there just a moment ago had vanished, replaced by an open, empty road stretching out into nothing. There were no buildings, no streetlights, just a vast, dark emptiness. And in the distance, I saw something. A faint light. A flicker, like the distant glow of a street lamp or perhaps a doorway. I ran toward it without thinking, the sight of it, however faint, filling me with something I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity, hope. But the closer I got, the more it shifted. The light dimmed and brightened erratically, like it was toying with me, luring me and only to pull away. It felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself from moving toward it. The idea of escaping this place, of finding something real, consumed me. With every step I took, the light seemed to retreat, just out of reach. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to realize that whatever I was chasing was only going to lead me further into this madness. But my body moved without my consent. I reached out a trembling hand toward the light, but before I could touch it, the ground beneath me trembled. The air shifted, and the world around me tilted. The light disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, leaving me standing in the middle of an empty void. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. And then I heard it. The voice. It wasn't the same whisper I'd heard before. This time, it was louder, sharper, like it was coming from everywhere, from all around me. "Why are you running?" the voice asked, low and guttural. It echoed in the stillness, filling the emptiness. "You can't escape. There is nowhere left to go." I stood there, frozen, trapped between the darkness and the void, and I realized the truth. There was no way out. There never had been. I tried to shake off the voice, to push it from my thoughts, but it clung to me like a shadow. "There is nowhere left to go." The words repeated in my mind, louder now, echoing with every breath. It was almost as if the very air around me had become thick with dread, and I was choking on it. I stood still in the void, my legs weak, my body trembling. My mind screamed at me to move, to escape, but every direction seemed just as impossible as the last. The emptiness stretched on forever in all directions. It felt endless, as though time itself had ceased to exist. The weight of it all threatened to crush me. I could feel the walls of this invisible prison pressing against me, growing tighter with each passing second. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, like the earth itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with something sinister. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy. The only sound now was the low hum of the void, vibrating against my skull, making my thoughts spiral further into madness. And then, there it was again. The voice. "Why don't you listen?" it whispered, far too close. Far too close. It wasn't the disembodied, distant whisper it had been before. Now, it was like a breath at my ear, cold and jagged. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct told me to run, to flee from whatever this was. But there was no escaping it. No matter how hard I tried to move, my legs wouldn't respond. My body felt as if it had been frozen in place, pinned by an invisible force. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but my heart pounded like a drum in my chest, and my pulse raced in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled apart from the inside, my sanity slowly unraveling with every passing second. The longer I stood there, the more the darkness seemed to close in around me, pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air out of my lungs. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the pressure eased. The voice was gone. The hum of the void fell silent. For a moment, I was left in a strange, suspended stillness, the kind that made every breath feel like an eternity. But I couldn't allow myself to rest. No, I had to move. I had to keep going. My mind screamed at me to find something, anything, that could bring me back to reality. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs stiff and uncooperative, each movement feeling unnatural. The ground beneath me felt like it was shifting again, but this time I couldn't tell if it was real or just another hallucination. I looked around, desperate for any kind of landmark, any sign of the world I once knew. But there was nothing. The void stretched on in all directions, unbroken and unchanging. It was as though the world had been erased. A blank canvas, waiting to swallow me whole. And then, just as I was about to lose all hope, I saw it. A light. Far off in the distance, flickering weakly. A pale, sickly glow. My eyes fixed on it instantly, and for the first time since I'd arrived in this nightmare, something other than fear flared inside me, hope. It was a faint glimmer, but it was something. A promise of escape. I tried to move toward it, but each step felt like wading through thick mud. The air seemed heavier the closer I got. The light flickered again, its intensity wavering like a dying flame in a storm. Was it real? Or was it just another illusion, a cruel trick of the mind? I had to know. I pushed forward, my breath shallow, my heart racing again. As I neared the light, it seemed to grow larger, but its glow was sickly, casting strange shadows that didn't seem to belong to anything tangible. The shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching and contracting like living things, twisting into grotesque shapes. I stopped a few feet from the light, staring at it with wide, desperate eyes. I reached out a trembling hand, the air cold against my skin. The moment my fingers brushed the light, it flared with sudden brightness, blinding me for a moment. And then, it was gone. I staggered backward, my eyes still stinging from the burst of light. When I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden darkness, I saw it. The figure. It was standing in front of me, its form more solid now, more distinct. I could see it clearly, and yet I still couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were impossibly thin, elongated to an inhuman degree. Its skin seemed to shimmer, as if made of shadow and smoke. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes, cold and watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as though the world around me had stopped, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The figure took a step forward, its long limbs moving in slow, deliberate motions, each one sending a wave of terror through me. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I couldn't. My body was paralyzed, frozen in place as it came closer. It opened its mouth, and for the first time, I heard it speak. Its voice was like the grinding of stones, deep and terrible. "You're here now," it said. The words sent a shiver of ice through me, straight to my core. You were always meant to be here. And in that moment, I knew. I was never meant to find my way home. I had never been meant to escape. The world spun, the darkness swallowing me whole as I faced the creature. And with it, I realized the path I had walked had never been real to begin with. It was all a test. A trap. A place where time had no meaning and reality was nothing but a twisted, distorted illusion. The only thing left now was to face it, whatever it was. And I knew in that instant I wasn't going to like what I found. The creature stood before me, its gaze piercing through the shadows like a force that defied logic. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. My muscles were frozen, rigid under the weight of its presence. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides, as though the space itself was alive and watching. It's strange how the mind works when fear takes hold. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, parched, as though the very air was sucking the life out of me. The darkness around us pulsed with an almost rhythmic energy, like a heart beating in sync with mine, but in the wrong way. The figure remained still, but I could feel its presence growing, filling the empty space. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even though every fiber of my being screamed to look away. Its face remained a blur, distorted and ever-shifting, as though the shadows themselves refused to reveal its true form. I couldn't focus on it, couldn't make sense of it. It was as if reality itself bent around its being, warping the space into something unnatural. "You should have stayed where you were," it said, its voice like the crackling of fire in the distance, cold and unfeeling, as though it wasn't speaking to me but through me. "There was no reason for you to come. No reason for you to seek this path." The words cut through me like a blade, each syllable wrapped in some strange, haunting certainty. I wanted to respond, to argue, but nothing came. My thoughts were muddled, tangled with fear and confusion. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. "You came seeking the truth," the figure continued. "But truth is not something you can hold. Truth is a cage, a never-ending cycle of searching, of never finding, of never escaping." It stepped closer. I felt the ground beneath me shift again, the world bending at the edges, as though the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. My vision blurred, and I had to blink rapidly to clear the fog that clouded my mind. The creature's presence pressed on me like a heavy weight, suffocating me with its certainty. It reached out a long, thin hand, its fingers like twisted branches that barely seemed to touch the air. "You are here because you sought something. And now you will stay," it said, its tone shifting, growing colder, more final. "There is no way back. There never was." I opened my mouth, but my voice caught in my throat, and I was left standing in a world of silence that pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't belong here, that this was a mistake, but the truth hit me with the force of a punch. I hadn't been lost, not in the way I thought. No. The path I'd walked, this place, had never been something I stumbled upon by accident. It had been waiting for me. I was always meant to be here. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice felt foreign, hoarse. The creature didn't answer immediately. It tilted its head, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw its face shift, a flash of something familiar, something unsettlingly human. But just as quickly, it returned to its distorted form, as if the image had been nothing but a trick of my mind. "I am what you sought," it replied simply. "I am the end of your journey, the last step, the one you cannot undo." I wanted to run. My body screamed for movement, for escape, but my feet felt glued to the ground, my legs like stone. Panic began to rise again, choking me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "You've walked too far," the creature whispered. "And now, you must decide." Its voice dropped to a low like the growl of a distant storm. "Stay with me, and you will understand. You will know everything, what you've been searching for, why you came, who you are. You will never doubt again." The air grew heavier, the space around me pulsing with something dark and ancient. But then, almost like a whisper on the wind, the voice changed. Or you can leave. Turn back if you still can. But know this, the path is gone. You will never return to the world you knew. You will be a ghost in a world that doesn't remember you. The words wrapped around my mind, suffocating me with their weight. The darkness, once so oppressive, seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, each step leading deeper into the unknown. I felt the weight of my decision pressing on me, my heart pounding in my chest as I teetered between two impossible choices. Stay and know the truth, but at what cost? To lose myself forever in this place? Or leave and be trapped in a world that no longer made sense, where everything I thought I knew would fall apart? My mind reeled. I couldn't decide. The fear of the unknown gnawed at me, but so did the pull of what I could learn, what I might finally understand if I stayed. For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. The figure waited, its presence looming like an endless, suffocating cloud. Then, in a flash, I made the choice. I turned my back on it. Without thinking, without looking back, I forced my legs to move. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape this place, even if I didn't know where the path led. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I thought I heard the creature's voice again, whispering in the back of my mind. But this time, it was faint, almost distant. Too late, it murmured. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had never seen a storm like this before. It wasn't just the weight of the snow that felt different, it was the silence. The kind of stillness that fills the air just before something awful happens. It was almost as though the world was holding its breath, waiting. I could feel it in my bones, this sense of foreboding creeping in, like an invisible hand pressing down on me, urging me to move faster. I had been hiking through the woods, following my usual path, but now I found myself caught in the middle of this blizzard. The trees, usually a comforting backdrop to my journey, were distorted by the fierce wind, their branches lashing out like gnarled fingers. The snow fell in thick, suffocating blankets, reducing the world to a hazy, monochrome blur. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, feeling the cold bite at my skin. It wasn't just the cold that unnerved me, though. It was something deeper. Something in the way the wind howled through the trees, in the way the snow seemed to fall without end. I had been walking for hours. My legs ached, and I felt disoriented, as though the landscape itself was shifting around me. It wasn't like the usual snowstorms I'd experienced. Those were harsh, yes, but they were predictable. This storm felt different, unnerving in ways I couldn't put into words. I paused for a moment, squinting through the storm, trying to get my bearings. I'd been in this part of the woods countless times before, but everything looked unfamiliar now. The trees seemed to crowd in closer, their twisted silhouettes barely visible through the thick snow and swirling wind. It was then that I saw it. At first, it was just a faint impression in the snow, but as I drew closer, I realized what it was, a set of tracks. Odd, irregular marks in the deep snow, leading off in a direction I didn't recognize. They weren't the fresh prints of an animal. No, these were something else, something that didn't belong. I knelt down to examine them. The tracks were strangely deep for the amount of snow that had fallen, almost as though whatever had left them was heavy, but there was no sign of a struggle, no indication of something urgent or predatory. They were deliberate, precise. A chill ran through me. I looked up, scanning the woods around me. The trees, thick and dark, seemed to be closing in. There was no sound now, not even the usual creaking of the branches. Just the cold, oppressive silence. The tracks seemed to lead deeper into the forest, disappearing into the white abyss. Every instinct told me to turn back, to retrace my steps, to find shelter before the storm got worse. But something compelled me to follow. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was something important about those tracks, something I needed to understand. I hesitated for a moment longer, then, against all reason, I began to follow the trail. Each step felt heavier than the last. The snow seemed to drag at my feet, and the further I walked, the more I felt as though the storm was closing in around me, narrowing my world down to just these tracks and the fear slowly building in my chest. The tracks led me through the dense woods, the trees thinning as I ventured deeper. The wind howled, and snowflakes lashed against my face, stinging my skin. But the strangest thing was the silence that accompanied the trail. Nothing moved. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of small animals scurrying through the snow. Just the sound of my breath and the crunch of my boots in the snow, echoing like a drumbeat in the stillness. The tracks began to grow fainter, the details harder to discern. But I pressed on, each step feeling like it was taking me further from the world I knew. There was a sense of urgency now, as if the storm was pushing me forward, urging me to follow. And then, I saw something. A shape. Just beyond the trees. It was barely visible in the swirling snow, but it stood out nonetheless. It wasn't a tree, or a rock, or anything natural. No, this was something other. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to make out what it was, but the snow blinded me. I squinted, stepping closer, and then I saw it clearly. It was a figure, tall and thin, almost inhuman in its shape, standing motionless in the middle of the woods. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence. It was watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, my body tense with fear, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The wind screamed in my ears, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Was this the source of the tracks? Had it left them? And if so, why? I wanted to run. I wanted to turn back, to forget this ever happened. But my legs wouldn't move. The figure, whatever it was, held me in place, its dark shape carved against the white storm. The longer I stared at it, the more I could feel something terrible building in the air. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just the fear creeping into my chest. No, it was something else. Something older. Something wrong. And then, the figure moved. Not in the way a person would move, not with fluidity or intention, but in a jerking, unnatural motion. It was like watching a puppet being pulled by invisible strings, each movement more disturbing than the last. It took a step toward me. That was all it took to snap me out of my paralysis. I turned, my legs finally obeying, and I ran. The snow whipped against my face as I sprinted back the way I came, my breath ragged and desperate. Behind me, I could hear the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow, following me. But I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare look back. My legs burned with every step as I plunged through the thick snow, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even slow down. I had to get away, had to escape whatever that thing was, whatever it was that had been following me, or perhaps waiting for me in the woods. The wind howled louder now, almost like it was mocking me, urging me to keep running. My breaths came in short gasps, cutting through the freezing air like shards of glass. Each inhalation felt like ice scraping against my lungs, but I didn't care. I had to outrun the footsteps. I had to outrun it. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it behind me, following. The crunch of snow, slow and deliberate, like the thing knew it could afford to take its time. I wasn't even sure it was human anymore. The way it had moved, that jerking, unnatural motion, it was as though it wasn't bound by the laws of reality. As though it had all the time in the world, and I was nothing but prey. My heart hammered in my chest. My head was spinning. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, how much distance I covered. The storm had turned into a blur of white, thick and blinding, the wind now whipping the snow into my face like 1,000 tiny needles. My eyes burned, and my body was going numb, but I didn't dare stop. The trees around me began to thin out. The woods that had seemed so vast now felt like they were closing in. Each step felt heavier. The snow was deeper here, like the earth itself was trying to drag me down. I was sinking. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was shifting beneath me, that the snow wasn't just snow anymore. It felt wrong, but I didn't have time to think about it. I couldn't afford to slow down. If I stopped, I knew I wouldn't be able to start again. And then I heard it. The sound of the thing behind me. But this time, it wasn't the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. It was faster, more frantic, as though it had decided it wasn't going to give me the luxury of time anymore. It was chasing me. I pushed myself harder, stumbling through the thickening snow. But the more I ran, the more the forest seemed to shift. The trees bent in unnatural directions, as if the very land itself had turned against me. The wind howled louder, and I could almost hear voices in the wind, low, distorted whispers that seemed to taunt me, to call my name. But it wasn't my name. It was something wrong. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of it. Was it the storm? Was I hearing things? Or was it something else, something worse, taking shape in the chaos of the storm? I couldn't answer, and I didn't care. All I cared about was getting away. But my feet felt like lead. The snow felt like it was holding me back, like it was pulling me into the earth, into the cold, suffocating ground. Suddenly, I slipped. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, landing flat on my stomach. The air rushed out of my lungs in a violent gasp as I lay there, breathless, surrounded by the deepening snow. I had to move. I had to get up. But my body wouldn't obey. My legs felt frozen, my hands shaking violently in the biting cold. And that's when I heard it. The sound of something heavy, something that shouldn't have been able to move so fast, crashing through the snow toward me. It was close. Too close. I pushed myself up, desperation flooding my veins. But before I could stand, something grabbed my leg. Something cold. Something unnatural. I screamed and kicked out, but it only tightened its grip. The snow around me shifted, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense, as though the ground itself was alive, pulling me into its depths. I fought, thrashing wildly, but the grip on my leg only grew stronger, colder. My pulse raced as I yanked my foot back, but it was no use. My muscles burned, but I couldn't break free. The thing wasn't just holding me, it was dragging me. I glanced down, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. A figure, almost blending into the snow, its dark, twisted form rising from the ground like it had been there all along, buried beneath the white. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something old. something ancient. Its limbs were long and spindly, twisted in unnatural angles, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were glowing faintly in the storm's darkness. It leaned in, its cold breath like ice on my skin. I had no choice. I had to fight. I had to survive. I reached into the snow, grabbing whatever I could, branches, rocks, anything, and started swinging. But the creature didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice. It just stared at me, its gaze hollow, empty, as though I were nothing but another lost soul for the storm to swallow. I struck it again. This time, I felt something crack. Was it its bone? Its skin, but the creature didn't recoil. Instead, it pulled harder. My leg felt like it was being wrenched from its socket. But then, with a final, desperate heave, I kicked it away. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backward, my breath ragged, my body shaking uncontrollably. The creature didn't follow. It stayed in place, standing still as the storm continued to rage around us. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment it felt as though the world itself stopped. The wind, the snow, the storm, all of it faded away, leaving only me and the thing in the woods. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the snow, dissolving into the blizzard as if it had never been there. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding, my body trembling. What had just happened? Was it real? Was it in my head? The storm had taken on a new quality now, quieter, calmer, but that only made the silence more ominous. I didn't want to stick around to find out. I turned and ran. Again. I couldn't stop running. My legs were heavy, my heart hammering in my chest, but I kept moving through the snow as though the storm had become an entity, something alive, something that could see my every step. The trees around me seemed to stretch endlessly, bending into grotesque shapes. They whispered in the wind, their branches creaking like the bones of something ancient. I kept my eyes ahead, trying to ignore the pounding in my skull. My breath came out in ragged bursts, freezing instantly as it hit the air. Every step felt like a mile. The world around me was a blur of snow and shadow. I didn't even know where I was anymore, what direction I was going. I just needed to get away, get as far as I could from whatever I had seen, or imagined I had seen. But the more I moved, the more the storm seemed to follow me. It wasn't just the wind. It was something more, something that felt like it was watching me. It wasn't enough for it to just follow. No, it wanted to hunt me. And then, I heard it again, the sound. It wasn't the crunch of footsteps anymore. It was something hollow. Something distant, but close enough to make my blood run cold. A sound like someone tapping against a tree with long, hollow bones. The rhythm was wrong, too steady, too methodical. It wasn't the wind. I paused. For the first time in what felt like hours, I stood still, straining my ears to listen. The sound was growing closer, but there was no movement in the snow. No shadows in the woods. I turned, my body shaking despite the cold, scanning the thick white blur around me, but all I could see were the trees, twisted and gnarled, reaching out toward the sky as if to trap me. The sound came again, sharper this time. A tapping noise, closer than before, and now I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. It was as if the snow itself was resonating with the sound, responding to it in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My heart pounded harder. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I took a step forward, then another, my every muscle protesting, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away from the thing that was so close now, but I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. It was as if something was holding me in place, invisible fingers tightening around my throat. The silence between the taps was deafening. Each second stretched longer than the last, until the sound of bawling against tree rang through the air once again. Closer. It was closer. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The snow was falling harder now, faster, thicker. The world seemed to close in on me. The familiar landscape, the woods, the trail, the storm, was becoming alien, distorted. The air felt dense, like I was breathing underwater, and there was a strange pressure in my ears, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. I wasn't alone. There, on the ground before me, a set of tracks. But they weren't the tracks I had been following. They weren't the footprints in the snow. These were different. I stared at them, my blood turning to ice. They weren't human. The prints were elongated, almost unnatural, the shape of them more like something that slithered rather than walked. Deep indentations, as though something heavy had dragged itself through the snow. And they led straight toward me. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My legs trembled, but I refused to fall. The tapping sound continued, louder now, like something was moving between the trees. But there was nothing. Nothing but the snow and the wind and the oppressive silence of the storm. I turned back to the tracks. They had stopped. The trail just ended. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense anymore. The storm was too thick, too consuming. I had lost all sense of direction. The tracks, the creature, the sound, everything was a blur of panic and confusion. And then, I heard the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but it grew louder, clearer. The words weren't human. They were too distorted, too garbled. But they were there. I could make them out. The voice sounded almost familiar, but it was wrong. Leave, before it finds you. I froze. The voice wasn't in the wind. It was in my head. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I whipped around, scanning the endless white forest. My breath caught in my throat. The tapping was gone, but there was something worse. A shape, no, not a shape, more like a presence. It was behind me, right on the edge of my vision. Something massive, something alive, yet somehow wrong. I couldn't look directly at it. I couldn't, but I felt it. I felt its eyes on me, as though it were studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I could hear its breath now, low and heavy, like the wind itself was breathing with a voice of its own. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Only feel. The storm intensified, and for the first time, I realized the snow wasn't just falling, it was swirling around me, tightening, closing in. My feet were slipping. The snow beneath me felt unstable, as if it were shifting, like the earth was giving way beneath my weight. I had to move. I had to run. The moment I turned to flee, the presence behind me shifted. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of something massive pushing its way through the snow, dragging itself closer, its breath hot against the icy wind. I ran. Through the trees, through the snow, away from whatever was following me, whatever was hunting me. But the sound grew louder. Closer. I had no idea where I was going. Only that I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Not this time. I ran faster, my legs burning with the effort, but my body felt as if it were moving through thick, unyielding mud. The snow clung to my boots, adding weight, pulling me back. Each breath I took was shallow and ragged, the icy air clawing at my lungs as if the cold itself were trying to suffocate me. The sound of something behind me, scraping, shifting, dragging itself through the snow, was relentless. It wasn't the wind anymore. No, this was something purposeful, something with intent. Something that was coming for me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it. The breathing, the scraping of whatever it was, the wet sound of something heavy dragging through the snow. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now felt like they were closing in on me, their blackened branches twisting into shapes that mocked human forms. Shadows loomed in every direction, distorting, shifting, as if the forest itself had come alive and was watching me, waiting for me to falter, to make one wrong move. My mind was racing. Was it a bear? Some wild animal, maybe? No, it couldn't be. The sound was all wrong. Too calculated, too methodical. And the weight of it, whatever it was like a storm, moving at a pace that didn't make sense. It was gaining on me. I kept running, but my feet were slipping, the snow too deep. It felt like I was being dragged into it. Every time I tried to push myself forward, the snow resisted, as if it were trying to pull me down into the ground itself. The presence behind me grew stronger, and I could feel its heat and unnatural warmth cutting through the frigid air. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. I could hear the breath, hot and ragged, like something that had been waiting for me, hungry, desperate. The air around me thickened. The silence between its breaths was maddening. It was close. So close. Suddenly, my foot hit something hard beneath the snow, and I stumbled. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground with a muffled thud. Pain shot up my legs, but I barely felt it. My heart was pounding too loudly in my chest to focus on anything else. My hands scrambled to push myself up, but the snow was thick and heavy. I couldn't find purchase. I couldn't breathe. And then, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy stepping in the snow behind me. It was right there. I didn't look up. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to stay down, to stay as still as possible, but my legs refused to listen. I pushed harder, trying to find the strength to escape. The snow felt like it was closing in on me, pressing down with an unnatural weight, like the earth itself was rejecting me. I looked to my left, eyes wide, searching desperately for anything. And that's when I saw it. The trees, once towering above me, were now leaning inward, their limbs like grasping hands. The white of the snow was no longer just white, it had shifted, turned into something darker. Something that wasn't snow anymore. A deep, cold shadow stretched across the ground, black as pitch, moving in unnatural patterns. I could feel it closing in, the air thick with an unrelenting pressure. And then I saw the tracks again. They weren't just tracks anymore. The ground before me was scarred, torn up in long, deep gouges. The snow had been sliced apart, as if something with claws had scraped its way across the earth. And in the middle of the snow, barely visible, was a hole. A dark, gaping hole that seemed to pulse with a life of its own, breathing in time with the strange rhythm of the presence behind me. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, the air around me shifted. The cold became unbearable, biting into my skin like needles. I could feel the heat behind me now, as if the thing following me was standing just a few feet away. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my heart skipped a beat. I heard the whisper again. But this time it was clearer, louder, not much longer. The voice wasn't coming from behind me anymore. It was coming from the ground. I looked down, and the dark hole in the snow seemed to pulse, grow, as though something massive was shifting beneath it. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the ground, and for a moment the world itself seemed to hold its breath. I could see the air around me shimmer, thick with heat, like a furnace. The trees around me creaked, as though they were bending toward whatever was beneath the snow, eager to see it rise. A low, guttural growl rumbled beneath the surface, and then it came. The ground erupted. I screamed as something massive and black shot out of the snow, clawing its way up toward me. I tried to move, to get away, but my body was frozen in place. I could hear its breath, louder now, nearly deafening. Its shape was almost impossible to comprehend. It was too large, too twisted. The air around it rippled with unnatural heat, and I could smell the rot that clung to it like a foul stench. The creature's eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto mine. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was not something I could outrun. It was not something I could fight. It was something that had been waiting. And now, it was here. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. And then, everything went black. I woke with a sharp gasp, as if the very air had been stolen from my lungs. My body was stiff, heavy, and I could feel the bitter cold pressing into every inch of my skin. The snow beneath me was soft, deep, almost too soft, like I was lying on a mattress. I had no idea how I got here. Panic set in immediately. My chest tightened, and I jerked my head around, searching for anything familiar. The snow, the trees, they looked like the same twisted figures from before. But this time, something was different. The world seemed quieter, unnaturally still, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. I struggled to sit up, my body aching with every movement. My fingers dug into the snow, trying to push myself up, but it was like the snow was pulling me back down. There was no path, no sign of the tracks I had followed earlier. Just endless white, stretching out around me like an ocean of snow. My heart was racing. I could still feel the heat of whatever had been behind me. It was still there, lingering in the back of my mind, like a whisper I couldn't shake. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. Was it real? Was I still in danger? I glanced at my hands. My gloves were torn, shredded, and there were deep gouges in my skin. My legs, they were scraped raw, caked in dirt and snow. But nothing explained how I ended up here. There was a sound, a faint rustle of snow shifting. My head snapped around, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Something was out there. It was too quiet now. The wind had stopped. The world felt too still. I tried to get up, but my legs refused to cooperate, as if they were numb from the cold. There was no choice but to crawl. Every movement felt sluggish, like I was fighting through a fog that had settled in my brain. My eyes darted around, searching for any hint of danger, but all I saw were the white trees, their skeletal branches bending in ways they shouldn't. Then, I saw it. A shadow. It moved between the trees, too fast for my mind to process. A flicker. A blur. And it was gone. My heart leaped into my throat. My breath caught. I tried to scream, but the sound lodged itself in my chest. I needed to move. My body was protesting, but I willed it to rise. Every step I took felt unnatural, my feet sinking deep into the snow, making it harder to move. The world was closing in around me, and I could feel it. That thing. It was out there, watching me, stalking me. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees leaning forward like an audience watching my every step. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled through the forest, breaking the silence, and I staggered, trying to keep my balance. I gasped for air, my lungs burning from the cold. The wind carried with it the faintest whisper, a voice, but not one I recognized. The words weren't words at all, they were something deeper, something ancient. Turn back. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The voice echoed in my ears, growing louder, more insistent. The whisper, the wind, the trees, they all seemed to be calling me, begging me to turn around. But where could I go? I couldn't even remember which direction I had come from. I had no sense of where I was. The snow, the darkness, it all felt endless. My breath came in shallow gasps. I staggered forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, pushed in a direction I didn't want to go. Every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into something that didn't want me to leave. The snow beneath me shifted again. I looked down, and for a split second, I thought I saw the tracks again. The deep, clawed impressions in the snow, leading off in the same direction I had been going before. But they weren't just tracks anymore. They were moving. The marks in the snow were shifting, as if something was crawling beneath the surface. Something with massive claws, pushing through the snow like it was nothing more than soft earth. My eyes widened in horror as the ground beneath me trembled. I heard a low, growling sound, closer this time. Much closer. I turned, heart racing, and saw it. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just a creature of shadow or sound. It was real. Solid. It towered above me, a blackened mass of twisted limbs, jagged claws, and eyes, countless eyes, glowing an unnatural yellow, scattered across its face and body like stars in a broken sky. It was the thing that had been following me. The thing that had been waiting. Its movements were erratic, jerking like it was a marionette being pulled in all directions. I could feel its presence, pressing on me, suffocating me. It was in the air, in the earth, in the snow. It was the forest. The woods had become its skin. I tried to run again, but my legs were numb, my body frozen in place. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused to listen. The thing loomed closer, its claws scraping against the earth, pulling itself forward. And then, I heard it again. That whisper. Closer now. It was no longer in the wind. It was right in my ear. It spoke my name. Leave, or you will join us. I turned, and for the first time, I looked directly at it, into the glowing, countless eyes that watched me, each one filled with an endless void. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The darkness swallowed me whole. It was 3 in the morning when I heard the first notification. A soft ping, a gentle vibration in the quiet of the room. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. The house was silent, still, too still, as if even the night itself had paused for a breath. I glanced at my phone. The screen lit up, revealing a message. But it wasn't from anyone I recognized. No name. No subject. Just a single word, written in cryptic symbols, a jumble of letters and shapes that made no sense to me. I stared at it, my mind racing. Could it be a mistake? A glitch? I frowned, trying to decipher it. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't make any sense of it. The symbols twisted in my mind, refusing to settle into anything recognizable. I shook my head, feeling a strange unease creep into my chest. It wasn't just a message. There was something about the way it appeared out of nowhere at the dead of night that unsettled me. I checked the time again. 3 in the morning. I wanted to dismiss it, to put the phone down and ignore it. But something told me not to. A deep, gut-wrenching feeling of dread gnawed at the back of my mind, urging me to stay alert. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, saw friends, did the usual routine. But the weird feeling remained, like a shadow following me wherever I went. That evening, as the sun set, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I was being watched. The sense of unease had only grown stronger. As I sat in my apartment that night, trying to focus on my work, the ping sounded again. This time, the message was even more cryptic, more complex. More symbols, more strange characters. But this time, there was also a word in plain text. Alone. I felt a chill run down my spine. Alone? It was as if the message was not just a string of random symbols, but something intended to speak directly to me. Something watching. I checked the sender's info. Nothing. No name, no email address, no phone number. Just unknown. I sat there, staring at the message, my mind racing. Who was sending this? How did they know I was alone? Was it someone playing a prank? My hands shook as I tapped the screen, trying to reply, asking who they were, what they wanted. But before I could send anything, the screen flickered and the message vanished. Gone. I blinked, unsure if I had seen it at all. I tried reopening the app, but there was nothing there. The inbox was empty. I checked my phone's notification history. The ping was still there. But when I tried to tap on it, it led nowhere. It was like the message had never existed. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off, to focus on something, anything else. But it was useless. That one word, alone, echoed in my mind over and over like an insistent whisper in the back of my head. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The screen flashed again. This time, the message was short, almost too brief to make sense of. It's coming. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. My fingers went numb as I looked at the screen, reading the same words again and again. But there was no time to think. Another ping. This time, the message was clearer. You know who I am. I've always been here. I froze. The room felt colder, the walls closing in around me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice felt trapped. My phone buzzed again. And then again. The notifications came faster, each one more urgent, more demanding. I couldn't keep up. I tried to read through the rapid fire of strange symbols, now mixed with words, now tangled with sentences that didn't belong together. And then, a final message arrived. It was just a symbol, a single shape. A circle with a line through it. I stared at it, trying to find meaning. But the longer I looked at it, the more it seemed to shift, as if it were breathing, pulsing in the darkness. I didn't realize it at first, but my hand was shaking. The phone slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor with a loud thud. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something in the air had changed. The room felt wrong. The silence was suffocating, and the walls felt as though they were closing in. And then, the knocking started. Soft at first, but then louder, sharper, relentless. Knock. 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 I didn't move. The knock came again. Closer now. It was coming from inside the apartment. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of stress. But the knock came again. Louder this time. It was unmistakable. The sound of something pounding on the walls of my apartment. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding against my ribcage. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. No shadow lurking by the door, no figure in the corner. Just the same cold, empty apartment I had been sitting in. And yet, the knocking persisted. The soft tap 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 had grown into something more forceful, like a fist hammering against the wall. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from outside the apartment. It was coming from within, inside the walls, deep within the very bones of the building. Tap tap tap. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. My eyes kept scanning the room, moving between the silence and the darkness. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And then, as if to answer my thoughts, the phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but my hand moved without my permission, reaching for the phone on the floor. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was weighing me down, dragging me further into the darkness. I opened the screen. The message was there, waiting. I'm in the walls. I could feel the blood drain from my face. It was a message that made no sense, but at the same time, it made every bit of sense. The knocking, the tapping, it was all connected. Whoever or whatever was behind these messages, they were right here. They were in my home. I looked at the message again, my eyes flickering over the words, desperate to find meaning. But the phone buzzed again, and my fingers trembled as I unlocked it once more. Let me in. The words sent a shiver down my spine. The air in the room felt colder, almost as if the very walls were closing on me, trapping me here with whatever presence was lurking beyond the screen. The knocking stopped. For a moment, everything went still. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe it had all been some terrible nightmare, a figment of my imagination, conjured up by the strange messages. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I could just go back to bed, put my phone down, and sleep. But I couldn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. And then, without warning, the door to my apartment creaked open. It wasn't the sound of a key turning in the lock. It wasn't the sound of a hand on the doorknob. No, this was something different. This was the sound of the door moving by itself. Slowly. Relentlessly. I didn't dare to breathe. The door creaked open just a crack, enough for a shadow to slip through. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the sliver of dark space between the door and the frame. The knock had stopped, but now something else had taken its place, a slow, rhythmic breathing, deep and labored. It echoed through the apartment, seeping into my ears like an invasive presence. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything, but my body was paralyzed, locked in place. The breathing grew louder, closer, and I could feel it now, pressing against the walls of the room. It was there. in the apartment, waiting, watching. I'd forced myself to look down at my phone again, hoping for some sign of explanation, something that could ground me, anything to hold on to. The screen flickered. Another message. I'm here. The door began to creak wider. A figure, tall, dark, and shifting, slipped into the room. It was like a shadow, a distortion of the air itself, slowly taking shape. It wasn't a person, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a collection of dark shapes, constantly shifting, writhing like smoke. I couldn't look away. It wasn't real, my mind tried to tell me. But I knew it was. It had to be. I wanted to scream, but no sound left my lips. The figure drifted toward me, moving with unnatural ease, like it was made of the darkness itself. I could hear its breath now, heavy and uneven, like something struggling to exist. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure froze. A soft, metallic sound filled the room. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. It was clear. I've always been here. You just couldn't see me. It was as if the words themselves were a trap, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I had no idea who or what was sending this, or how they were inside my walls, inside my home. But the terror in my chest was unmistakable. The figure stepped forward again. And then the lights went out. The darkness was thick, like something solid, suffocating. The room I had once known so well had become unrecognizable. My eyes strained to adjust, but there was nothing to focus on, nothing but the oppressive blackness that swallowed everything. I felt the cold air wrap around me, pulling at my skin, like invisible fingers brushing over my arms. It was too quiet now, too still. I could no longer hear the breathing, no longer feel the presence moving in the room. But I knew it was still there, lingering in the space just beyond my reach. My heart raced in the silence, pounding in my chest as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers felt numb, shaking as I searched for the light. But when I turned it on, the screen flashed briefly, then flickered out. The phone was dead. The fear in my gut grew, deepening with every passing second. Without the light, I was completely blind. Without the phone, I had no connection to the outside world. Alone. Trapped. I stood motionless for a moment, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and then a sharp sound cut through the stillness. The floor creaked. It was faint, but unmistakable. I wasn't alone. I turned, straining my ears to listen, hoping for some sign of where it was coming from. Was it footsteps? Or was I imagining it? Suddenly, the room wasn't still anymore. The shadows, once stagnant, seemed to shift. A low rustling sound filled the air, like fabric brushing against fabric, or something moving just out of view. My muscles tensed, and every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Who's there?" I whispered into the darkness, my voice shaky, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the void. No response. But then, I heard it. A faint, distorted voice. It wasn't quite human, but it was close. It felt like something inside me was trying to speak through the static of my thoughts. "You can't hide from me." The words crawled under my skin, icy and foreign. The voice wasn't coming from any direction. It was everywhere, as if it was inside my head. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. I tried to shake it off. I tried to focus, to think, to make sense of it all, but the fear was overwhelming. My hands trembled at my sides, and I felt a cold sweat beginning to form on my brow. Then, I saw it. A faint glow in the corner of the room. It wasn't from the phone or any light source I could explain. It was a flicker, like the dying embers of a long-dead fire, casting an eerie glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. And there, shifting in the glow, was the figure. The same one that had been there before. But now, it was clearer, more defined. A grotesque silhouette against the light, its form twisting and warping like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its outlines seemed to break apart, reforming as though it was made of smoke or shadows or something even worse. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a terror that clawed at my throat, threatening to choke me. The figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate. It was growing, expanding with every movement. I could feel its presence pushing against the walls, pressing down on me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked onto it, drawn in by some force stronger than my will. "You're not alone." The voice spoke again, this time closer, as if the figure was standing right next to me, breathing into my ear. I could feel the coldness of its presence, its breath, if it could even be called breath, like ice on my skin. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't go out. Instead, they blinked on for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see something truly horrifying. The face of the figure. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. Its features were twisted, malformed, its eyes too large, too wide, and its mouth stretched open in an unnatural grin that didn't match the rest of its form. It was like looking into an abyss, something so wrong, so alien that it made my stomach churn. The lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. The air in the room was thick with tension. My heart hammered in my chest, my breaths coming in jagged, panicked gasps. I waited for the next move, but the room remained silent. The glow was gone, the presence had faded. It was as if everything had just stopped. I staggered back, my hands reaching out to find something, anything to hold on to. The phone was still dead, my apartment still cold. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That whatever it was, it hadn't left. Not really. I needed to leave. But there was nowhere to go. I was trapped, and it knew my name. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. I hesitated, staring at the screen, knowing what would be waiting. But the words were different this time. "You can't run." The phone vibrated in my hand, the sound pulling me back into reality like a rope, dragging me from the edges of my panic. I didn't want to look at it, but I had no choice. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating before I swiped it open. The message was simple, but its impact was immediate. "You can't run." I stared at the words, my heart sinking. They were the same, almost like a warning, a promise, a certainty. But how could it be? How did it know I was thinking of running? How did it know I felt trapped? I didn't have time to consider it further. My mind was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, the sensation of being watched now more overwhelming than ever before. I turned around, my eyes searching the room again. It felt different, warmer, but still charged with that same unsettling presence. I wasn't alone, I knew it. But I couldn't see what it was. The figure from earlier, the one I thought I'd imagined, wasn't here anymore. But its mark lingered. The cold sweat on my neck told me it was still watching. I backed toward the door, moving slowly, afraid that any sudden motion would trigger something, anything. The thought of stepping into the hallway seemed almost as terrifying as staying in this suffocating space. What if it was waiting outside? What if I was running into its arms? A flicker of light caught my eye, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. I snapped my head toward it, but again, there was nothing. My breath hitched, and I felt a rush of dizziness as my body screamed for escape, but my feet refused to move. There was no sound, no creaking floorboards, no whispers, just the suffocating silence of the room pressing down on me. I was hyper-aware of the air, the feel of it against my skin, the almost oppressive pressure around me. Every small noise, a shift in the air, the faintest squeak of the floor felt like a roar magnified by the silence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling. A part of me wanted to turn around, to look over my shoulder one last time to see if the figure was there, but I couldn't. I refused to. I couldn't bear to face it again. With a soft click, the door swung open, revealing the dark hallway outside. My apartment felt like a prison. This hallway, this familiar place, felt infinitely more dangerous now. I stepped into the corridor, feeling the door close behind me with a finality that made my skin crawl. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, silent, like it always had been. But now, it felt like a maze, each step taking me further away from the safety of my home, deeper into whatever waited for me. I could feel it. The presence, the weight, the thing that I couldn't see but knew was always near. The buzzing in my chest grew louder, the sensation of being watched intensifying with each breath I took. It wasn't just the phone anymore. It was everything. The walls, the floor, the very air around me seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a force that wasn't natural. I had to keep moving. I made my way down the hallway, each step echoing in the silence. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, just a fleeting glimpse, a movement at the edge of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing. Nothing but the dark. The walls seemed to close in on me, the space narrowing, suffocating. The quiet was maddening, and the silence seemed to weigh on my chest like a stone. I couldn't breathe properly. The phone buzzed again, and this time I didn't hesitate to look at it. "I'm closer than you think." My heart stopped. It couldn't be. The message, it wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a warning. It knew where I was. It was here, somehow, watching me from the shadows. The presence that had been lingering was no longer something I could dismiss as paranoia. It was real. It was hunting me. I turned quickly, scanning the hallway, but saw nothing. The cold, familiar corridor felt alien, a place of nightmares. But it was getting closer. I could feel it. I needed to find a way out. I needed to make it stop. The fear gripped me tighter than before, my breath shallow and rapid. Every inch of the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, a never-ending tunnel leading me further into whatever awaited me. I had no idea where to go. I had no idea who to call. I was alone. Completely alone. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up, the words appearing in bold letters. "I know your name." And then, just as I read those words, I felt something cold against my neck. Something watching me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the dark hallway. Just the silence. But I could feel it. Right behind me. The chill on my neck was unbearable. It wasn't just the cold of the night creeping into my skin, it was something else. Something foreign. Something that didn't belong. My body was frozen in place, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. The air around me seemed to hum with tension, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an invisible force, ready to snap. I turned, slowly, almost afraid to face whatever was behind me. The hallway stretched out, unchanged, still dark and silent. No footsteps, no whispering, no sign of anything or anyone lurking in the shadows. But the feeling didn't go away. It was there, just beyond my reach, hiding in the dark corners of my mind. I raised my phone again, hoping for some distraction, for something that could break the tension. But as soon as I looked at the screen, I realized the worst part. The message was different now. You should have listened. I felt a pang of cold dread. These weren't just random threats anymore, they were warnings. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this was growing closer, more desperate to make me understand. The words seemed to pulse with some kind of malice, vibrating on the screen as if they were alive, like they were burning their way into my brain. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I had to think. I had to do something. My apartment was just down the hall, and yet it felt so far away. The distance between the front door and the safety of my bed seemed insurmountable. But I couldn't stay here. Not in this hallway, not with that feeling that something unseen was creeping closer, inching towards me with every breath I took. There was no choice. I had to move. I took one tentative step forward. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, a sound so loud in the stillness that it made my skin crawl. The walls seemed to close in around me, narrowing with every second. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light anymore, it was alive, moving, pushing in on me from all sides. My heart raced in my chest, the sound of my pulse in my ears growing louder, almost deafening. Then, suddenly, the light above flickered, casting the hallway in a sickly, intermittent glow. And there it was. A figure. A shadow. Not just in the corner of my eye this time, but fully formed, standing in the distance at the end of the hallway. It was tall. Too tall. And impossibly thin. Its limbs were stretched unnaturally, like they were made of shadow itself, and its head hung low, almost as though it was too heavy for its neck to hold up. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no eyes, no mouth, but I could feel it. I could feel its gaze piercing into me, even without seeing its eyes. I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood draining from my face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. It was the thing that had been stalking me all along. The presence that had been following me from the very first message. It was real, and it was here. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, it moved. Slowly at first, then faster, its long, disjointed legs gliding across the floor, dragging its thin body toward me with a predatory grace. The sound of its movement was unnaturally quiet, like a whisper of wind, but the presence of it filled the space, pushing into my lungs, suffocating me. I had to move. I had to run. But my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs were shaking, my mind refusing to acknowledge the terror that was closing in. My hands fumbled for my phone again, but the screen was now black. The battery was dead, or had it been drained somehow? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was alone, completely alone, with this thing that wasn't human. It was closer now, only a few feet away. Its presence was suffocating, overwhelming, as if the very air around me had thickened into something dense and unbreathable. My chest felt tight, and every inhale was a struggle. It was then that I heard it. A whisper. Not from the creature, but from the phone. The screen flickered, the words appearing once more, this time in jagged, distorted letters. You belong to me. I looked up in a panic, and the figure was now standing in front of me. It had no face, but I could feel its gaze, could feel it seeing through me into every dark corner of my mind. It was inside my head, in my thoughts, in my soul. And in that moment, I understood the truth, the messages, the phone, the figures in the shadows, they had never been separate. They were all connected. The fear, the terror, the messages, they were a part of it. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. I could hear my heart in my ears, beating faster, almost frantic. The thing's presence loomed over me like an inescapable force, and I knew that if I didn't escape, if I didn't fight, I would be swallowed whole. But just as I thought I might turn and run, the hallway warped. The walls stretched and twisted, as though the very fabric of reality was bending, pulling apart. The door to my apartment, the one I had been heading toward, was no longer there. The hallway had become endless, looping, a maze of darkness and whispers. I was trapped. In that moment, a thought flitted through my mind. Had it always been this way? Was I always going to end up here? The phone buzzed one last time. You're already mine. And then everything went dark. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.